Hi, I'm Dr. Dan Ratner. Today I'm joined by Harold Kapowicz, the founder and medical director of the Child Mind Institute, an organization that focuses on mental health in children, research, treatment, and working against the stigma that keeps kids from speaking out about their suffering. The Institute has gotten excellent press for its successes and its intent, including its association with such celebrities as Bill Hader, Zoe Saldana, Emma Stone, Jesse Eisenberg, Kevin Love, and more. If you haven't already, click subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, hit like if you like what you're hearing, and put your comments below, and we'll get back to you personally. And finally, you can reserve your place in one of my seminars or purchase any of my mind-body guides, also known as the PDFs, at www.crushingdoubt.org. Now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Harold Kapowicz. Harold, it is such a pleasure to have you here. I'm so excited to hear about your work at Child Mind Institute and to compare notes on how we think about children and mental health and all kinds of other things. So welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure, Dan. Really been looking forward to talking to you.
So you do really fascinating work, and the place that I wanted to start might surprise you. I went to a kindergarten that was psychoanalytically oriented. It's a place called Hannah Perkins, great place in Cleveland, Ohio. And I learned so much about myself, and I grew up in such a different way where I was really taught to feel that children can be respected. And when I was looking at the work that you do, that's what felt like it radiated out. I just had that feeling about it. I wonder if you could just comment on how you came to do this work and how you think about kids in these regards.
So it's really interesting. Our journeys to where we get professionally, I think, has so much to do with our early experiences. And I'm not a psychoanalyst. And even though, because of my age, part of the way you dealt with academic growth and professional development, I did get psychoanalyzed, but I didn't become a psychoanalyst. I'm the oldest child of two immigrants. My parents were born in Poland, met in law school in Warsaw in the 1930s. My father actually graduated law school in 1936, and my mother was in law school when they shut down the law school when the Nazis marched into Poland. And
Wow.
my parents are Jewish, and it was a horrific experience. My father was in 14 concentration camps, as well as surviving the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And my mother left the ghetto with false papers, with fake papers, identity papers as a Catholic, and survived the war by going to 16 different villages, including a convent, where she hid in the convent, working as a maid. And she was not a very good housekeeper. So this was, and so you would think that people who had these tremendous losses, by the way, I'm named after 3 or 4 dead people, and they were very traumatized, yet they were incredibly optimistic. They believed that tomorrow would be a better day. And so when they came to the United States in 1949, they were incredibly patriotic, incredibly positive. But what was really important is that I get a profession that I can keep in my brain and my mind, and that it will be something I could travel with. Because the problem with law is that Polish law is Napoleonic, and the only place you could practice Napoleonic law in the United States is Louisiana. And they had heavy accents. And so they really felt that that most important thing, the knowledge they carried in their head, didn't travel. And so they desperately, but very covertly and overtly, wanted me to become a physician. And so from a very early age, I think either I decided or they decided that I was going to become a pediatrician.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got sick when I was 12 years old. I developed idiopathic thrombocytic purpura as a side effect of German measles. I think people forget how serious German measles, mumps, chickenpox, polio was before we had vaccines. And one of the side effects of or complications of German measles is that it could affect your clotting factor, your platelets. And I lost all my platelets after this virus, which meant that if you touched me too much, I would bruise and I would start to bleed. And
Wow.
so for at least 2 or 3 weeks, they thought I had leukemia, which was a death sentence back in the 1960s. And so therefore, I was going to see hematologists and cancer specialists and pediatricians, and they figured out that it was this side effect of German measles and that it wasn't cancer. And so even though I had to have bone marrow removed from my sternum and we were on the road to Memorial Sloan Kettering and to a journey of cancer, it turns out that lots of steroids and patience and time, your platelets will come back. But it made doctors even more powerful and more positive, as that's what I was going to do. And so when I went to medical school, the idea was I was going to be a pediatrician. And yet it became very clear, thanks to some professors of mine, that pediatrics, even though I was good at it, kids get sick and most of the time they get well. And when they don't get well, they basically, if you don't get well, a specialist comes in and takes over, and the pediatrician just takes care of the worried parent. And I had a terrific professor in radiation oncology who basically said, you want to be on a frontier. And if you want to be excited by something, and if you're going to insist on working with kids, try child psychiatry, that they're starting to image brains with something called the CAT scan at Columbia, that they're giving descriptions, they're treating kids with a different type of respect. They're giving medication to children at Washington University. And so if you're on a frontier, you're never bored. And one of the things that I found that when I went into, I had to do general psychiatry first, is that if you respect the patient, if you understand their pain in some ways, that it's very real, unfortunately very common also, how often people suffer from mental health disorders, that's the first step. And that, I think you may have picked up, so that recently a patient came to see me, or parents brought a patient who was 14 years old, and the parents had a terrible divorce. And on top of everything else, the child had a terrible, beginnings of a full-blown depression, but she was also non-binary and trans. And I was struggling while I was doing the interview with her with the pronouns of they and them, because it's very plural. And I kept using she, and she, with her parents in the room, they got very upset. Then when the parents left and we started to talk, and I think she could see that I was very respectful of the pain she was in, the difficult situation she had with her parents' divorce, and with the journey she was now taking. But I made the mistake several times of saying she instead of they. When their parents came back into the room, and I made the mistake again, her father jumped on me and said, "It's they, not she." And this young person said, "Dad, Dr. Koplewicz is trying. He really is. He's just old." And I thought, they definitely got the fact that I was on their side, that whatever was going on, I was going to help fight the pain, and we were going to join forces. And that's really essential when it comes to mental health disorders, because very often the patient goes on the side of the illness. I mean, I'm not really depressed. I'm really not disturbed. My illogical thoughts are normal. You should have those thoughts. God is talking to me. He's not talking to you. And so you find yourself not only fighting the disease, but you have to fight the patient. And if the patient and you do not feel like there's mutual respect, I think it's very difficult to get onto a real therapeutic alliance, that I'm here to take you on this journey, to be your Sherpa. I will get you up that mountain and down that mountain, or I will get you through that tunnel. There's light there. But we're in partnership. And that's sometimes very hard for doctors who take care of kids to recognize that you have to partner with them, because otherwise, and with their parents, and make sure the teacher comes along for the ride also. But because we're so used to treating kids, not as little people, but as people who don't have their own agency.
Right. Oh, I'm so moved by so much of what you said there. I mean, first of all, you have quite a history, your family history. I have Polish background also. We did not have Holocaust survivors. Our family got out long before then, but that's pretty mind blowing. And I think the thing you said that really struck me about the whole thing is that you came to what you do through all sorts of experiences. What your parents had brought to the table, what went on for you, what you were drawn to. But I am so glad you're out there, because to have a doctor doing what you're doing who respects kids on that level, I find to be very rare. And I'm hoping that over time we'll get it to not be that rare. And your story about this transgendered patient, it's so indicative. I almost said she, they didn't care that you were messing up the pronoun. They got that you respected them. And you're able to communicate that, and I think it's so important.
Well, Dan, I think, look, I would become a child and adolescent psychiatrist in a New York minute all over again. And you have to remember, I'm older than you, so that when I was growing up, being a banker meant you were a teller or a manager of the local bank, right?
Mm-hmm.
Venture capital was most probably someone who went to DC a lot. There was mergers and acquisitions always sounded like a sexual position to me. But the point is that there were lots of things that in the middle class and then upper middle class neighborhoods that I grew up in the suburbs, people who were businessmen weren't as respected as people who were lawyers and doctors and accountants and dentists. And so clearly, there are people I went to high school with who were smart enough to go to an Ivy League college and then go to Wharton and work and be a banker, an investment banker.
Mm-hmm.
So now I know about those options, those tracks, and I would tell you I wouldn't do it. I love the fact that I don't want to stop being a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I don't want to stop being the head of the Child Mind Institute. And lots of my colleagues in medicine are retiring. They're very upset with their careers or with the finances of it. And so I really would do it all over again. But what I find is that what makes it challenging and exciting is that lots of times doctors of all different stripes do not necessarily respect the patient, and they're still able to do their job very well. They still can take the tumor out. They can fix the cavity. They can fix the broken leg. And, respect and mutual partnership do not need to be part of the recipe. We have to do that. And then I think the second piece, which is essential, is we have to get a diagnosis. And I think so often kids go to a clinician and the parents don't get a diagnosis, don't ask for a diagnosis. And when they do, they say, oh, we're still figuring it out. And that really lacks respect. Because I think if you do not give someone a diagnosis and then tell their parents what the treatment options are, you're wasting their time, you're wasting your time, you're wasting money, you're hoping that everything's just going to go away over time, when in reality, some of these illnesses get worse or they stay the same, and they can have tremendous ill effects on the development of your brain and on your life. And so I think diagnosis, just think about it. If you have a cough, do I give you an antibiotic or do I give you an antihistamine? Do I tell you to go and get some bed rest? Do I tell you to gargle with some salt water? Well, it all depends if you have pneumonia or a virus or an allergy. And the same thing goes for a symptom like inattention. You could be gifted and therefore bored and inattentive, or you could have ADD or ADHD, or you could have anxiety. So unless we get that alliance and then get a diagnosis, I think that, we're kind of like being very disrespectful to the patient's time, the parents' money, and the fact that we can really change the trajectory of a child's life if we can get that diagnosis right and the treatment right. Because once you take away those symptoms, we're off to the races. I can't tell you how often, Dan, we get parents who, when we say to them after 4 sessions or 8 sessions, come back next month. And the mother will say, you don't want to see my son next week? No, it's not necessary. Next month will be fine, or 3 months. And I had one mother say, don't you like my son? I said, I love your son, but I think he'd be better off playing baseball or doing homework or playing the clarinet than coming and just sitting with me because you think you're supposed to see someone every single week. When what we're trying to do is get rid of symptoms and hope that the outside world will be reinforcing good stuff on your kid. And we're always here. If you need to come back more frequently, we certainly will do that.
Right.
And that's a different mindset also than a lot of ways people, particularly psychoanalysts, were treating that I had a commitment that I had to be there 4 times a week, whether anything was bothering me or not. It was a different kind of journey.
I totally agree on multiple levels, and I'll just say a couple of them, and then I have another question. But first of all, having the right diagnosis is what matters. And I heard you saying that it's not just having a diagnosis, it's having the right one, because otherwise, what are you doing? I do short-term consultations now. I grew up in a family of analysts, as I mentioned. I've been through a childhood analysis. I've been through an adult analysis, and none of it led to the changes that I would have hoped, as much as the work that I've done in mind-body work. So I had 8 years of chronic back pain, and eventually even went to a therapist thinking, okay, maybe this is psychosomatic. Which it did turn out to be, although that's a misunderstood term. Psychosomatic doesn't mean in your head. It means from your head and real in your body, as I'm sure you know. And I got more information from that. But some of it also came from respecting myself as a patient. And so I think the thing that you bring to kids with that is wonderful, because this is very high stakes. And I got this from your site. I was researching some about child mind. And some of the stats really blew me away. Half of all mental illnesses begin before age 14. 75% of them before the age of 24. And those are incredibly important stats. And if I think about them, they're not surprising. But it's not the way that we look at the kids. The way we look at the kids is, oh, you're so young, you don't have problems.
Or if you have problems, you'll outgrow them.
Right.
And if you think about, so historically we thought, okay, these symptoms are bad for your life. For instance, you can't stop washing your hands, or you have a repetitious thought in your head that you have to touch things a certain way. So of course that's going to impair your morning routine, getting to school. But we also now know, because of MRIs and functional MRIs, that it's bad for your brain. It's almost like the circuit, your brain is misfiring, and the longer it keeps misfiring, it causes almost like micro damage in your brain. So that if you have obsessive compulsive disorder at 50 and you got it at 12, it's much more difficult to treat. You're most probably going to have to use medicine for a much longer period of time, versus if you got it at 12 and we start treating it at 13, the hope would be that, we can, quote unquote, to get these symptoms so under control that you graduate high school and go off to college. And if we recognize that maybe that's the hiccup in your brain, that if you're under a lot of stress sometime in the future, or you do a lot of illicit drugs, or you get, you stop sleeping a lot, that maybe that OCD symptom might come back. But in the meantime, your brain has gone back onto a normal trajectory. But for instance, we know that autism comes on before the age of 3. We know that symptoms of anxiety show up at around 5 to 8. ADHD, the first signs of it is before 6. Depression has its first peak at 13. So there are normal things in developmental, and why do we make the cutoff 24? Well, at 24, the prefrontal cortex, that structure behind your forehead, finally starts communicating to the rest of your brain. So you put a condom on, you put a helmet on, you put a seatbelt on, you start to understand about cause and effect, not only opportunity. So, we always think if we can only get to it before the next brain burst or the next trajectory, we can get you back on the right road. And if symptoms come back, so be it. But it's not like we had you on the couch for 5 years. We only kept 16 sessions or 20 sessions, and we had you on the baseball field or the football field or the dance class or the debate team, whatever it was that made your life so much more rewarding.
It's just wonderful to hear you talk about, though, kids at being kids. Now, one of your latest initiatives was with the actress Gabore Sidibe, and she has a quote. I just wanted to read it back to you and kind of tell you what my thoughts were about this. She said, "Everyone would tell me I was too young to feel sad all the time, or too young to feel stressed out." So that quote is something that resonates with me. I was quite stressed out about a lot of things, but people would tend to say, "Oh, no, you were too young." In fact, a lot of my trauma began when I was born. I was born into a family where my father died when I was 6 weeks old. And people would say, "Oh, you're so lucky that this happened so young." But if we think about it, my whole brain chemistry was formed in that kind of situation. So I find that what people said to Gabore is totally backwards.
Right.
The younger a child is, the more vulnerable they are.
So So you'll appreciate the fact that, so we try to do three things at the Child Mind Institute.
Mm-hmm.
We want to offer gold standard care. We want care that has some evidence.
Yeah.
So we don't do play therapy because we can't prove that it actually works. We don't even do biofeedback because the evidence is not strong enough in kids. So what we do with psychosocial interventions, whether it's behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, parent management training, has a body of research evidence. And we know that if you do 10 sessions versus 5 sessions or 15 sessions, that we have some idea of what the percentages of outcome will be like. We know that when we use medication, that we like old medicines. What do I mean by that? I'd rather use Prozac that 1 million kids have taken than Lexapro that only 150,000 kids have taken, and it's 10 times more expensive. So to make sure that I stay honest, we don't take money from the pharmaceutical industry. We don't let pharmaceutical representatives come onto the grounds of the Child Mind Institute because inevitably they're attractive, they're articulate, and they always bring food, pens, and Post-its. So I'd rather buy everyone pizza once a week and say, you know, if you're going to use medicine, I'd like you to use the medicine that has the most evidence. But I think that the second thing we do is research. We are trying to find a biomarker. We're trying to find the difference between you, let's say, who has an anxiety disorder, and me, who has depression, and we're both 16 years old. Because if you could find that, it's like a strep test. Strep gets penicillin, virus gets T and rest. And that's very challenging because we can show you brain differences of typically developing kids and atypically developing kids, but or group differences, but we can't do the one-on-one. So we're giving away 10,000 free evaluations, and we're giving kids psychiatric exams, neuropsych testing, cardiovascular fitness, genetics, nutritional status, physical fitness, hair analysis, teeth, baby teeth analysis. It turns out that the baby teeth give you some idea of what went on intrauterine, voice analysis. It is the largest data collection of the brain of kids 5 to 21 that's ever been collected. And amazingly, 11% of the kids we've seen so far, we've seen around 7,000 of the kids, don't have anything. They have a mother or father that are worried about them. They have some symptoms. They don't have a diagnosis. 62% of them have 2 or more diagnoses. But all of the research we do at the Child Mind Institute, we share our data before we publish, which is very challenging because that means that sometimes other people get the aha moment. They get to the journal before we do.
Yep.
But it accelerates the pace of research. So we have electrical engineers looking at our data at Virginia Tech. We have geneticists at Hopkins. We have statisticians at Hopkins, geneticists at Rockefeller. People that I don't have to pay who want to look at our data and accelerate it. So we don't get the credit, but the field gets that acceleration. But the third thing that we do, which I think might be the most important, is we try to destigmatize these disorders. This kind of real common treatable. So childmind.org, our website, has had 58 million visitors. And during COVID, we jumped from 400,000 unique visitors per month to 1.6 million unique visitors per month.
Wow.
So for a not-for-profit, that's big numbers. But one of the things we feel that we have to do is educate parents and now teachers and also kids. So in May, we do these campaigns, and you're quoting from one of the campaigns. We started in 2017 with #MyYoungerSelf. What would I tell my younger self about my struggle? So Emma Stone was May 1st, 2017. May 2nd was Jesse Eisenberg. They both have terrible anxiety disorders. May 3rd was then Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom from California about his dyslexia. And May 4th was supposed to be Carrie Fisher, because May the 4th be with you. And she had overdosed before we got the video. She had terrible bipolar disorder as she manic depressive illness when she was 16. So we got her brother, Todd, to do a video. But we've done this repeatedly in 2017, 2018, 2019. In 2020, we Thrive Inside. We got 40 influencers to tell us how they were managing their mental health during COVID and how they could manage inside the house. And in 2020, we shifted it. We decided, let's get kids who aren't famous. My name is Sam. When you're worried, ask another kid, talk to your parent, talk to a teacher, ask for help. And we got 20 people that, because of my age, I don't know them. They're YouTube influencers, TikTok influencers, but they're in some hot program on Netflix, you know, and it really helps to hear people say, you know, it's brave to reach out for help. So I think, those things have reached this year's rate, had 3.6 billion media impressions. And that's not typical for a child psychiatry or a child psychology program to be concerned about a whole bunch of people out there that we will never physically touch or will never really talk to. But we think that kind of ripple effect will help kids get to the doctor faster when they need it. Figure out that they shouldn't wait with symptoms. They should get their symptoms seen sooner.
Well, and I do want to give a shout out to the celebrities who speak out about this, because they are very important. These are people who are willing to talk about these things, and it, to me, very little would have more of an influence to destigmatize these things.
And by the way, for young boys, having athletes do it.
Oh yeah.
So Kevin Love,
the
basketball player. I love Kevin Love. It's like he came to the Child Mind Institute, super tall and handsome. And then he talks to you and says, I was a fat guy in college. I was a mess. I wasn't telling anyone about the therapy I was getting. I was getting panic attacks. And finally he said, when I had a panic attack on the court, I decided I have to come out of the closet. I have an anxiety disorder. I need to get treated. I'm still a strong guy. And it's almost like he came out of that anxiety suit, and we gave him this award, and it was at Carnegie Hall. He came in a tuxedo. He said, "I can't believe it. I'm getting an award in Carnegie Hall. I felt like I had to be in black tie." I mean, but he's got a wonderful sense of humor. But if you're a 12-year-old boy and you're struggling, you see this terrific hero, great athlete, it makes you feel 10 times better. So.
Yeah, and more and more stories are coming out about that. But
Yep.
I applaud them, and I applaud you for giving this platform. It actually, though, made me wonder, when you started out with the Child Mind Institute, it sounded like you wanted to do something kind of big. You had this teacher who said, think, be on the cutting edge of something. Right, be on the frontier. What was the initial idea behind it? What got you excited about it?
So, I've had a very easy career in the respect that I was 32, and they made me the chief of child psychiatry at Long Island Jewish, which is now Northwell, but I had been offered around 6 months before to be the chief of child psychiatry at Emory. I just didn't want to move to Atlanta. And usually you don't get jobs like that until you're 40. So I think it was the fact that I did a research fellowship. But then I left after 10 years, and I became the vice chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at NYU. And they let me build the NYU Child Study Center, which became a separate department of child psychiatry.
Oh, wow.
It turns out I'm good at raising money and convincing people that this is an important cause. And I was at NYU for 12 years, and it became very clear that there was a conflict. Why was child psychiatry getting so much attention? Why wasn't the money going to pediatrics? Why were you on the Today Show so much? I mean, it was on twice a year. Now, why are you thinking about the Today Show so much? So it just became clear that child psychiatry needed an independent nonprofit, right? Because the average parent waits 2 to 8 years from the onset of symptoms before they go get help for their kids, because of stigma, because of lack of access, lots of different reasons. And so when I left, instead of going to Mount Sinai or to Cornell or Columbia, I was very fortunate that a group of philanthropists came with me, and we had an opportunity to think about this for around 6 months. And the model turned out to be St. Jude's Children's Hospital. Mm-hmm. So this, for most people, don't realize that St. Jude's is a small hospital. It has 78 beds. That it was developed because of a bet that was paid off. For around 55 years ago, Danny Thomas made a prayer to St. Jude, the saint of hopeless causes. He was a very famous TV actor, and he wanted desperately to be a movie star, and he wanted a part in a movie. And if he could get this script and this part, he would thank God by building a hospital for kids who were dying of cancer or had cancer. And he got the part. He never really became a movie star. He was but a very, very famous TV star. And he decides to build this hospital in Memphis, which is one of the most segregated cities in the United States, mm-hmm. Open to all kids. No child should die in the dawn of their lives. I mean, really creative stuff. He got Elvis Presley to visit, and he gave celebrity to it. But somebody smart talked to him, and he was smart because he listened and said, this better become a research hospital, because 94 out of 100 kids who have pediatric leukemia die. And they became laser focused on these conditions. And if you had insurance, you could pay. but if you only could enter if you had the right cancer. And what they did is they changed the course of pediatric leukemia. So now 4 out of 100 kids die, not 94. And I think what else they did that was really impressive to me is they made Americans care about those kids. So instead of whispering the word cancer or calling it the big C, people now embrace those kids with the bald heads, And the problem that I thought for children's mental health disorders is that there's only 15,000 kids in America who have cancer. There's 200,000 with diabetes. There's 7 million with asthma. There's 17 million with a mental health disorder. So we have the most common illnesses of childhood and adolescence. Most of the kids don't get treated. Only 20% of kids with anxiety disorders ever get any treatment. So these diseases get worse over time. And so while you have 2 million kids with depression who are teenagers, but you have 40 million adults in America who have depression, because every year those teenagers become adults. This really deserves more attention. It deserves more research dollars. It deserves parents saying my insurance should really pay for this the same way it pays for my kids' diabetes or cancer or well care. And that you can only do that in an independent institution. That if we would have gone to Columbia or Mount Sinai, that eventually the same thing would happen. You're not that important. You don't make that much money. You don't have a procedure. And it became essential that we became independent. And also at a medical school, they would say it's not your job to educate Americans about how real, common, and treatable these disorders are, because how is that helping the medical center? And I understand it completely, but if our job is to transform the lives of children with mental health disorders, well, then accelerating the pace of research makes sense, even though we might not get the grant or might not get the aha moment. Spending a lot of time on PSAs and public service campaigns makes sense, and offering really the best type of care. So, and we do things that I think are, we now have we have a $15 million grant from the Stavros Niarchos Foundation to train and change the way children are treated with mental health disorders in Greece. And it's going to take us 5 years, but we're getting partners at the University of Athens and with 4 different children's hospitals, because the quality of their care is not evidence-based, and they want to improve the whole country's way of approaching this. Now, again, that wouldn't typically be something a medical school would be interested in. It's absolutely, we say Greece today, Turkey tomorrow. We definitely think that if we're just doing okay here in the United States with kids with mental health disorders, we know the rest of the world is not doing nearly as well as us.
Yeah.
And we unfortunately believe that the psychological tail of COVID is going to be very long, that there is going to be a significant group of kids who cannot get back to school. They got too comfortable in front of the screen because they were already a little separation anxious. They liked being with mom and dad. They got stomach aches when they were away from them, or headaches. There's a whole bunch of kids with social anxiety. If you look at them the wrong way, they feel like they're being bullied, or they perceive slights as insults. They're going to have trouble going back to school. The kids with OCD, there's a group of kids with PTSD. So unless we give teachers a new set of tools for their toolbox, and help parents and even help kids understand that sometimes exactly what you're talking about is your body is talking to you, but it's really your brain. And how do we fight those feelings, or get past those feelings, jump over our amygdala, so to speak, and still be able to get back to school, is really important. We have a big project that we're working on now with the state of California, with figuring out, can we do little films? Can we produce little films for lower school kids, middle school kids, and upper school kids, and do it in Spanish and English, have companion pieces for their parents, and more importantly, really help teachers get tools, and maybe even give them continuing education credit. So, it'll go toward a better salary, or even pay them to watch the video. So, because they're going to be overwhelmed.
Right.
We know children have a learning loss. The only way we get over it is if we get them back into school and focused and attentive. And there's lots of reasons, as said before, that people are not as attentive as they could be if something is bothering them.
So you've been speaking my language the whole time, but as you were talking about that stuff, you started to hit on some very key points for me. The whole idea, for example, of a kid getting a stomach ache because of separation. I did wonder, how you think at the Child Mind Institute about mind-body experience, because we know, and this comes from research, there was the Adverse Childhood Experiences study in 1998. It was a Kaiser Permanente study, very large study. I'm sure you're familiar with it because you
Sure.
know all
And
these
Nadine
things.
Burke, who's the Surgeon General of California, is one of the biggest advocates to not only understanding ACEs, the adverse experiences, but also making sure that teachers and doctors and parents understand it also. That doesn't mean that everyone who has an adverse experience, there are people who are remarkably resilient, but for us to understand the potential toxicity of those things.
Yeah, and actually, I would throw a slight wrinkle on it too. I think we could even say that even people who do get affected by this, it's not necessarily that they aren't resilient, and I think you'd agree with that. It's a type of resilience. It's
Right.
like a
Correct. Oh, absolutely.
it's like a way of coping. But what they found in this study is that the incidence of major physical conditions went way up when people had an adverse childhood experience or multiple ones. And we're talking about things like abuse at home, the loss of a parent, substance abuse in the house, even divorce, which is not to say people shouldn't get divorced, but there are things that really profoundly affected these kids. And what they found is, as you know, the incidence of heart disease, the incidence of diabetes, the incidence of cancer, they all went up. And of course, on top of it, the incidence of depression and anxiety would go through the roof with these things.
Right.
What I found is that in psychology, as I went through it, as I kind of went to my own therapy, I started to come to see that people who are not trauma informed, who don't understand that these traumatic events affect you in huge ways, including bodily, that those people they're missing the boat and they're not going to be able to help as well. So I'm curious, what's the Child Mind Institute take on that?
So, it's interesting. We hired someone around 10 years ago who had been working with vets in the Boston VA system that was part of Harvard. And everyone said, I don't know what are you doing? And I said, we need a trauma specialist. And we need trauma service. And so this remarkable psychologist, Jamie Howard, just started working for us, and we had Hurricane Sandy, or Superstorm Sandy, and parts of New York City were terribly affected, like Far Rockaway. So the schools were closed down, and then you found out that the kids who had already pretty brutal adverse experiences, that their fathers had disappeared or they were living in tremendous poverty, those kids' absenteeism just jumped, or tremendous amount of physical complaints. They were home not because they said they were just home. Oh, I have terrible headaches or stomach aches. And so what started off as a very small service and with a small earmark from the city council has now developed into something that New York City actually funds, this trauma service, as a SWAT team, so that we now get $770,000, and we've changed mayors, we've changed city council, and yet all the different parts of New York City say, no, we want this service. So if there's been a sexual assault at a school, if a child has died because of a car accident or a suicide, or there's a gun shooting, we have a SWAT team that we don't need to go and get written permission. We're already there. And whether we'll do trauma-related, group treatment to help them with their stress, or be able to refer them to someone who knows trauma-informed treatment, it has made a world of difference. And the ability to get there fast. So there was a terrible tragedy where a father literally decapitated his wife, and then killed their kindergarten student, and then suicided. And the principal of this, it was the Hunter School, which is a gifted program with a very hard entrance exam. They called us that night and said, it's going to hit the newspapers tomorrow. We need to help the teachers. We don't know what to tell the kids. We don't know what to tell the parents. By 7:00 the next morning, we had Jamie and one of her team members separating the teachers, the parents, and telling them what kind of scripts they should use, what are the symptoms and signs they should look at for kids over the next few weeks. That kind of prevention, so to speak, is really important. So I think in some ways we're the leader in the field. So, and unfortunately, after the Newtown shootings, we were sending people up there. Again, if you don't have an independent nonprofit, there's no money for this.
Right.
I mean, you make money when you see a patient. It's piecemeal business. But if you're running an independent nonprofit and you rely on philanthropy, well, then you have the funds to say, fine, let's send 3 people up there for the next 2 weeks.
Right.
And let's not worry about who's going to pay for that.
You're free to do the good in the way that it needs to be done. And that includes that, like when you accelerate the research process and it may not get you the credit, I give you a huge amount of credit for that because it shows the real commitment to.
Well, I want to be honest, Dan. When the vice president of research, who I hired, his name is Michael Millam. He's a PhD,
Mm-hmm.
and he's a PhD, MD PhD, and he said, "I have an offer at Cornell. I have an offer at Cornell, Pittsburgh, and Mount Sinai. But I'll come to you, even though you're a new shop, if you permit me to give away my data before we publish."
Oh,
and
wow.
Wow. I said, wait, that's a big deal. I'm going to pay millions of dollars to get you to get the data. And he said to me, Harold, how old are you? And I told him, he said, well, I'm 20 years younger than you. If you want to be around for the answer, we got to speed up the pace of discovery.
Wow. Yeah.
And when he said that, I thought, he's right. I don't have a dean over me. I don't have someone saying, how's it good for us? This is good for the field. So he's the one who came up with the idea. And I have to tell you, it's brilliant. We've published around 400 articles in the past 10 years in peer-reviewed journals, which is very impressive for a small research group. But close to 3,000 articles have been published by other people using our data.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean,
but
we're doing good, and I can be very proud of what we've accomplished in 11 years.
Well, and I would say this is part of being an adult in a good way. Is to say, you know what, I don't need all of the credit.
Right.
We need to get it done. And actually, I was thinking about what you said about that tragedy where you were called in, or about Newtown, and I think that it is so often the case that it's not the kid who isn't ready to talk. A lot of times, it's the adult who isn't ready to talk.
So it's a perfect segue because before COVID hit, my colleagues and I had been talking about the fact of what was the common denominator of everyone who came in. And that was that parents would tell us that they worry what will happen to their kids when they're not around, when the kids have to go to college. Could they be independent? And the whole idea was that you don't have to fix your kid or do for your kid, but you do have to scaffold for your kid. And so I am the author, but it was really based on a lot of colleagues' work of the scaffold effect.
I was going to ask, yep.
You're scaffolding and your kid's the building. And if you do a good job, when the scaffold comes down, the kid knows when he needs a scaffold again, right? So when he goes to college, if he's really in a bad mood for 3, 4, 5, 2 weeks, days, he goes to the mental health clinic. Or if he can't write his first paper, he goes to the writer's workshop. He scaffolds. But it turns out that we didn't know that COVID, of course, was coming. And one of the most important things we talk about in the book is self-care, that self-care is childcare. And that if parents don't recognize they have to sleep, they have to eat properly, they have to exercise, they have to eat something green, and they have to be encouraging and give themselves support and structure, because if the scaffold isn't strong and something catastrophic happens and the scaffold falls down, the building falls down. Well, COVID came, and that was the catastrophe. And so if ever there was this moment that we have to keep thinking about, the metaphor, you're on the plane and the flight attendant says, oh, put the mask on yourself. Self-care is childcare, particularly even now as COVID is slowly getting into our rear view mirror. We're going to need to keep taking care of ourselves to take care of our kids.
Yeah, I use that plane analogy all the time because, we think we're supposed to take care of the other people, and we are, but you cannot take care of yourself. You can't take care of others if you can't take care of yourself. And in the meantime, we all were children. So whatever our scaffold was around us, we carry that forward. And I think one thing I've talked about on this show a little bit is generational trauma and how it gets passed down. And I think what you're saying about the scaffold effect, which I did want to ask you about, it's indicative of the fact that we really need to be more thoughtful about how are we going to build this? How are we going to support the kids? But I think, to me, the key element is the respect for the kids, the mutuality of it. And
well, I would also tell you that the hard part, I think, for a lot of parents is that they reinforce and praise product instead of effort. And that's easy to do. Your kid comes home with an A and you say, yes, but instead saying, wait, the kid's been working so hard with the tutor and got a C plus in algebra, we should have a celebration.
Right.
Effort is because it's the hardworking kid and the hardworking adult that makes you successful.
Yeah, and not only that, I'll just add one thing to it. I'm sure you will agree with this because we really see eye to eye on these things. But in addition to praising effort more than results, I also think we could praise just who they are, just as they are.
Well, yeah. Well, that's part of, is your child, you're the scaffold, but if your kid wants to be a skyscraper or a bungalow or a mid-century or a quirky Victorian, we should celebrate that because they're going to live in the house, not you. So that you're absolutely right. You have to celebrate who your child is.
It's beautifully said, Harold, and I want to thank you for coming on here to talk. I would love to have you back if you're willing to. I would love to talk with you more about research that maybe we can do to find out what works in the mind-body world, why we're making the breakthroughs that we are. I mean, we've been my partner Greg and I have been thinking a lot about how do we show why this works. It has to be shown, and so I look forward to hopefully having some conversations with you about this. You've done remarkable work. I'm so glad you're out there, and I'm just very grateful for you. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, and it's been a pleasure talking to you.
You too, Harold. Well, I feel like I could have talked with Harold all day. He and I have so much in common, and I'm drawn to so much of what he does, but the fact that he's a big thinker and he always works to find the quickest path to the best solution for the most people is so wonderful to see. But most of all, as you heard us talk about, he takes the child as a co-agent in the situation. They're not secondary. They're just as important, if not more important. And I think that's the way that I like to work with the people that I work with. And really, we're all children at heart. So that's the way we build trust. He's doing great work, and I was just so honored to have him join us. If you haven't already, click subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, hit like if you like what you're hearing, and put your comments below, and I'll get back to you personally.